Hello and welcome. I'm Shireen Ban, and joining me today is a panel from government and industry. Jay Panda, businessman turned politician, one of the most vociferous campaigners for pro-development policies in Orissa. Rajeev Chandrasekhar, one of the country's first telecom sector entrepreneurs, a Rajya Sabha MP from Karnataka, often takes on the government and corporations alike on governance issues. Pramod Basi, now non-executive vice chairman of GenPact, Basine is in many ways the face of new age globalized business in India, and he's also helped build the BPO industry. Arun Maira, member of the Planning Commission, he began his 40-year corporate career with Tata Sons in 1964, and after a decade in the United States as an advisor and consultant to business and governments, he returned in 2000 as the head of the Boston Consulting Group in India. For 2 years now, he's been a member of the Planning Commission, and this series is based on his book, Transforming Capitalism. Gentlemen, many thanks for joining us. Mr. Maira, today we're going to be discussing the role of the government if we are indeed putting in place a new capitalist structure. And I want to bring to you the issue of how we've moved from an era of self-regulation, less regulation, to now perhaps an era of over-regulation or of at least sensible regulation. What's your thought on this?
Last 20 years, there's been an era of triumphalism with the fall of the Berlin Wall and Fukuyama's thesis of the end of history, that the idea that government is bad and leave it to capitalism and the private sector is good, seem to have won. However, what we've experienced in the last few years in particular in the West and also now experiencing in India, that we seem to need government for something. Now, what is that something?
And we're not quite sure what we need it for.
What it is, exactly. And how government should then function. And we don't want government to work unbridled in isolation of the needs of the other sectors, which is the capitalistic sector, the private sector, and the people too. So we need to form institutions of government and the private sector and people's representation which work together to devise how to regulate the system of which we all are a part. And that's the idea that we are seeking now, in which government has a role, which it did not do very well, maybe not doing very well even today, but it needs to perform that role more effectively.
Jay Panda, Reagan said that the government is not the solution, it is actually the problem, and yet we're asking the government to address the problems that we're faced with in this capitalist world today. What is the middle path? How do we actually evolve a new way of the government participating with not just industry, but also with people?
Well, ultimately, the government is something that people have voted for, and people can then seek accountability from the government. They haven't voted for corporations. Now, in the last 20 years, the pendulum swung too far away from big government and a big state kind of a paradigm. Now, corporations being even less accountable than the government have taken advantage of the system in a way that has hurt everyone. And I'd characterize this in two words. One is recklessness. The kind of reckless lending that banks have done in Western countries, which has led to the worldwide crisis. And number two is gaming the system. Now, in India, you've seen corporations that have gamed the system and taken advantage of non-transparent dealings behind the screen. The government has to again sort of step in and make sure that there's a level playing field with transparency. But we can't swing all the way back to statism, because that never worked. We should not forget that it didn't work. What we need is to find a balance between state intervention and between having free markets.
Rajeev Chandrasekhar, you just heard Jay Panda here talking about the middle path. We can't go all the way back to statism, yet we require the government to intervene. What could that middle path really be?
No, Shireen, and I don't agree with Jay that there is a middle path. Most of the problems that we are seeing today, whether it's in India or in the West, are a consequence to a large part of the failure of some institutions, institutions of government like the regulators. And clearly in India, for example, we have not been able to build over the last decade, 2 decades, when the concept of independent regulators really took on, we have not been able to build credible institutions of government. The answer is really to create independent, credible institutions.
Rajeev, you're talking about independent institutions like the TRAI, like SEBI, but even these institutions today are mired in controversy. Even their independence and their autonomy is under question.
I am making the point that there has been a failure of these institutions because they have not grown to the capacity and the quality that they should have. They have to occupy this space between government and corporates. I agree with Jay that corporates are running riot today, but they're running riot not because there is not enough government. They're running riot because they've captured government. And that is why we need a middle institutional layer, which is...
You come back again to a middle path, aren't you? You just criticized Jay for saying that, the middle path doesn't work, but you're coming back to a middle path.
I'm saying government is not the middle path. I'm saying there is a space between government and corporates that has to be occupied by a group of institutions that regulate capitalism. Capitalism is not bad, but if unregulated capitalism is free for all capitalism.
Okay, Pramod Bhasin, you're part of an industry that has always been proud of the fact that you've been able to flourish and grow because you haven't really had government intervening, you haven't had the interference of the government. You've had the debate so far. Where do you stand on this?
Let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater here. Capitalism has brought an enormous amount of good to the world. It has helped economic progress. The day India loosened its socialistic ties, it has helped India grow further. Unbridled, unregulated capitalism, dealt with the way it has been in the last 10 years, has really been bad, and there are a lot of clever people waiting to exploit whatever chinks they find in regulation or transparency. But the bulk of the world doesn't behave like that. And I think apart from a middle ground, I would just call it a third path. What we need is open, more transparency, light regulation, but with penalties which are onerous so that it makes people realize that the consequences of their actions are serious and will be very detrimental to them. It requires clarity of purpose and policy.
Question, Arun Myra, is who defines these targets? Who sets these targets?
That's the key.
And it comes back again to whether it's the government.
No. We talked about middles, and I tell you two of them. One of them is this middle, which is the connection, the process, the place where the private sector, that's the capitalist sector, the government sector, and the people sector intersect. They talk together. There's a good consensus there about the norms. And all corporations, government, and the people, their own representation, must then live to build the institutions from their side to conform to those norms.
But how do we make these institutions more robust? Because the Planning Commission's job, if I may, is to pretty much do this, is to build consensus on important issues. It is to get participation from civil society. It is to take all stakeholders' points of view on board. But yet, we don't really see that being reflected in actual policy making.
The process that, for example, the Planning Commission has used the last 60 years has been, if I could say, a pretty academic and elitist process, right? It is about people who understand economics, talk those languages, come to certain shows which are, watched by people like themselves. But when you say include the people in this conversation, I don't think we are reaching out enough to include them. So that conversation is the place, the missing middle, which will help us to then tune up all the institutions.
Okay, Rajeev Chandrasekhar, one of the issues that I want to talk to you about is this business of government trying to bail out the private sector. We've seen it happen post-2008 in America. We're faced with that situation here, whether it is the banking sector, you could call it recapitalization, or it is bailing out private airlines. Of course, nothing much has happened on that front so far, but really the role of the government when it comes to bailing out private enterprises.
No, and there is an interesting phrase that I first heard when in the US, in the context of the US bailout, which is the moral hazard. And I think that word hasn't been used enough in the Indian context. Yes, I think government should be prepared to bail out if public policy is the reason businesses go bad or investments go south. If there's a force majeure kind of an issue like the nuclear sanctions.
If a sector is taxed by in excess of 50 or 60%, wouldn't you say that was unfair?
But that is something, if you have a set of assumptions that you knew before you put in risk capital, you have to take the consequences of that business. You can't now sit back after 6 years and say, excuse me, the taxes that I started out with are not taxes that I like now. That's not an argument. In the same way, the argument can't be that recapitalization of public sector banks is recapitalization but not bailing out because the NPAs have gone up to 20%. Somebody should be asking a question, excuse me, why did the NPAs go up to 20% in the last 4 months? Was it government-directed lending?
Okay. Pramod Bhasin, every time the private sector requires government intervention by way of a reduction in taxes or anything else which actually will enhance their margins, you approach the government. We've seen that happen for the IT sector. We've seen that happen as far as the sunset clause for the SEZ policy was concerned. We've seen that happen time and again.
I agree broadly that I think industry should stand on its own feet. We are always looking for the next handout or the next concession that can help us. And in most of the cases, frankly, the government has been quite helpful. So let me offset that. So for instance, a classic example of government intervening to help industry was Satyam. You know, I think the speed with which the government acted at that point in time was remarkable. It was really well done. However, apart from just talking about, you know, looking for handout, we must remember the burden that industry carries, the burden of creating your own power, your own transportation, your own training, your own skills, your own infrastructure, the cost. I mean, we can go on. So I think, again, we come back to what is the ground here where industry must accept its responsibility to make margins. I absolutely agree with Rajeev on that. You can't complain about this subsequently.
Yeah,
but equally, government holds the power and the ropes to a large part of this economy.
I'm glad you brought up the Satyam example. I just want to get comments from everybody on that. Rajeev Chandrasekhar, do you believe that the government was right to step in as far as the Satyam controversy was concerned?
No, I think that was clearly an exception because it was A, an IT company, B, it had a number of consequences in terms of employment, international contracts and the credibility of a sector. And the government did not play did not do the bailout with taxpayer money. My issue is only that when taxpayer money is put at risk, the government better think 3-4 times before they start dishing out that money.
Okay, on that note, we'll take a quick commercial break and come back to you and discuss capitalism in crisis.